Display block, display inline, and display inline block, as well as float left and float right, are a couple ways that we can control the layout of our page. We also have some more advanced ways to do this, using positioning. This allows us to specify exactly where on a page or in the viewport our content will appear. First, let's look at position relative. I'll create a div and then use position relative to adjust its actual position on the page. I've created a basic div with some basic content. I'll add a couple styles so we can see what this looks like. Here I've given it a padding of 10 pixels, a solid black border, and a light gray background. In our page, we can see this is slightly positioned off the top left. This is because I'm not using normalize to clear that padding, and we have some layout on our content. It's also filling the entire page. This means other content will flow below it as it's rendered. Let's see what happens when we set this to position relative. I've set the position to relative. Reloading the page shows that nothing actually changes. This is because position relative doesn't actually remove our element from the normal content flow. What it does allow us to do is specify top, left, bottom, and right values in order to adjust where this content will appear. Let's say that we want this to appear 10 pixels above where it actually is. Here I'll set the top to -10 pixels, and we can see that it's been pulled up above the page. Mousing over it shows exactly where it is. Position relative is slightly unique though. Let's take a look at a more complicated example. I've added two span tags around my div so that we can see what our layout would look like. When I refresh the page, we can see that our box now sits on top of our first content, but our second content still flows normally. So here's where our first content is, and here's where our second content is. This is because the browser still renders the div itself where it's supposed to be. It takes in the same amount of size and the same amount of content, but actually renders its visuals based on the top and left and right and bottom properties that we specify. For instance, if I change the property that's changing the position of this element, this div, let's see what changes. Here I'm going to change the bottom property to be -10 pixels. This will pull it 10 pixels away from the center of the content. I'm now just specifying bottom, it will move the whole content. Refreshing the page, we can see that this is moved down, but neither of our first content or second content have changed their position. When working with positioning, you really only want to use position relative to help set context for position absolute, which we'll look at next. You can also use it for minor offsets for content, but you don't want to use it to move your content, say, 100 pixels down the page, because it will give you weird results of your layout. If I change this value to 100 pixels, it's hard to tell what's going on here. This is just a big empty space, even though our content is now currently down here. So you want to avoid using position relative for this sort of content change. Position absolute allows us to specify exactly where our content is going to be displayed based on a context, which currently is the document. So let's see what that looks like. The other thing to note is that position absolute will remove this element from our layout, unlike position relative. In my CSS rule set, I'll add a rule for position absolute. Note that I haven't specified any actual positioning, just the rule type that I want to use. It's pulled this block level element out of the normal flow, set its width to automatic, and allowed this span tag to be in line with this span tag. So already our layout has been changed, but we'll see that the position of this element is actually technically where it should still be. So let's set the top and left properties to see where that places this content. I'll set the top to 0 pixels and the left to 0 pixels. This pulls our content to the exact top left of our page. It's also been displayed on top of this other content. This is because it's been pulled out of the normal flow. There's still normal flow within the positioned absolute element, so this content will still be in line, but the element itself has been pulled out of the normal flow that it sits within. We can also use the right value to move this to the right side of the page. Here I've changed from left to right, still setting 0 pixels. Now our content is on the right side of the page. I'm going to reset our styles so that we can see how relative will affect the layout of our content. I'm going to change this selector and update my HTML to talk about relative and absolute, just so we can see what these do. So in my main content, I'll set this div to have the class of relative, and here I'll wrap this content in the absolute positioning. So now I have a relative container with an absolute element inside. These are arbitrary classes, so this isn't going to make anything magical happen. So let's just see what this looks like based on our CSS rule set that only sets a padding, border, and background of our relative div. So this looks about the same as what we had before. Let's add some additional styles so we can tell the two apart. Here I've added 10 pixels to our absolute element, 10 pixel padding, a 1 pixel red border, and a white background. This pushes our content around a bit by adding a bit more spacing to this element. Now let's set our absolute element inside, the absolute class, to be positioned absolute at the top left of 0. I'll add position absolute, and I'll set the top and left to 0. Since 0 is the same regardless of what element type it is, I can just put 0 here. Refreshing our page pulls it out of the layout so we can see that our container div is now collapsed and now contains only the padding, and our absolute element is now positioned to the top left of the page. This is exactly how we set it up in the previous example. But let's say that we want to use this gray div as our positioning target, as our context for the absolute. Because it contains our absolute element, we can use position relative to set up an additional context for this item. If all I do is add position relative to our relative classed item, the browser will use this as the new context. Refreshing our page pulls our element to the top left of the container item. Absolute positioning will use the top, left, right, and bottom properties as relational sets based on hierarchy. It will go up the tree until it finds the next position relative element, and it will use that. If it doesn't find an element that has position relative, it will use the whole document. So that's why we were able to see our element at the very top left of the page before we added position relative to our relative class. It's also important to note that position absolute contains that same hierarchical structure as position relative, which means if we add another position absolute element inside of a position absolute element, it will use this as a context. I've added another div of class absolute within our class absolute here. What I'm also going to do is adjust this class so that it will use the right side of our content instead of the top left, so that we can see that it's actually using a different layout. I'll create the absolute right class. Here we can see our absolute right class has a padding of 10 pixels, a border of green, and a background of a light gray. And I'll set this position absolute give it a right value of 0 and a bottom value of 0. So in our HTML, we have a relative parent with an absolute child that also contains an absolute right child. In our CSS, we have a relative rule that just adds some styling so we can tell these items apart and sets the relative class to position relative. We then set our absolute class to position absolute with a top and left of 0, and we set our absolute right class to a position absolute right and bottom 0. When I refresh the page, we can see that our top absolute element is using the top left of our relative element, and our inner absolute element is using the bottom right of our second absolute element, regular absolute. This can get a little bit confusing, so it's worth taking some time to mess around with seeing how these different layouts will affect your content. Another layout property we have is the position fixed property. Fixed is a bit like absolute, but it uses the actual viewport as its layout context. My basic HTML here is including the span and a div that says here's some fixed content, as well as a second span so we can see what the layout changes to. I'm going to add a style for our div and give it some padding and background color so that we can set it apart from the others. Our div now has a style of padding 10 pixels, border 1 pixel solid black, and a light gray background. We can see that this looks as normal, and our flow puts the block element in between the two spans. Let's add position fixed to our fixed content div. All I've done is added position fixed, and let's see what this looks like. So here we can see that it stayed in the same place. This is a bit like what happened when we set it as absolute. Let's see what happens when we set a top and left. Here I've set it position fixed with a top 0 and a left 0. And just like absolute, it sits at the top of our page. But let's see what this looks like when I actually increase the amount of content on the page. Here I've added a new paragraph tag with some basic placeholder text inside to increase the height of our page. So nothing really changed here. But as I scroll down through the page, we'll see that our fixed element sits in the top left of our viewport, overlaying the content, but still being positioned in the top left. Let's see what happens if I change this to absolute and see what this does for our scrolling layout. In the CSS, I'll change this to absolute, and reloading the page shows no change until I start to scroll. Here, absolute is using the content of the document as its positioning context, versus fixed, which is using the viewport, the window with what we can see, as its positioning context. This is useful for sticky navigations, like main navigations that will be at the top of the page, and that stay with the user as they scroll through content. As with absolute and relative, fixed also sets a context for its own contents as well, so we can position things absolutely inside of a fixed content item.